Now, as you have learned, or as you will learn when you study community property, as a general rule, upon the intestate death of a spouse, intestate death, dying without a will, the surviving spouse usually receives their own undivided 1/2 interest in community property. So the surviving spouse usually receives the surviving spouse's own undivided 1/2 interest in community property, which becomes the surviving spouse's now separate property or sole property because the marriage ceases to exist. The surviving spouse also generally receives the remaining other undivided 1/2 interest in the community property of the deceased spouse, presuming again that no exception applies. In addition, the decedent's separate property descends and is distributed pursuant to California's intestate succession law found in California's probate code. The first person that we check when analyzing how an intestate decedent's estate is distributed is the surviving spouse or domestic partner. And the amount of separate property that the surviving spouse receives depends upon which other heirs survive the decedent. In California, a surviving spouse is generally entitled to one of 3 dispositions. They're either entitled to all of the separate property, half of the separate property, or 1/3 of the separate property, of the decedent's separate property. So all, half, or 1/3. And you should know generally how each one of these 3 scenarios may play out. Okay, first, when the intestate decedent isn't survived by a descendant, a child, a grandchild, a parent, a sibling, or even the issue of a deceased sibling like a nephew or niece, then the surviving spouse or domestic partner inherits all of the separate property of the intestate decedent. So when there are no other survivors that meet these criteria, no descendants, no parent, no sibling, no niece or nephew, the surviving spouse gets the entire separate property estate. That's scenario number 1. Scenario number 2. When an intestate decedent is survived by only one child, or the issue, which means the descendants, kids, grandkids, of only one child, then the surviving spouse is entitled to half of the separate property. That's the second biggest portion that they would be entitled to. Full estate, half of the estate. And half of the estate when there's only one surviving child or a line of issue of one surviving child. So if a decedent had 3 children, only one survives, the other 2 children predecease the decedent and have no children or surviving issue, under that circumstance, the surviving spouse gets 1/2 of the separate property estate. But there's another scenario when they'll get half, and even if the decedent leaves no issue at all, no children, no grandchildren, nothing, if they leave a surviving parent or a surviving issue of a parent, but again, no descendants, then the surviving spouse or domestic partner, again, is entitled to take 1/2 of the separate property. Right, so those are the 2 scenarios under which the surviving spouse gets half of the separate property. The third scenario is when the surviving spouse gets 1/3 of the separate property. So the surviving spouse may only be entitled to 1/3 of the separate property, the smallest portion, if more people survive. Right? Specifically, when the intestate decedent is survived by more than one child, or one child and the issue of at least one deceased child, or the issue of 2 or more deceased children, then the surviving spouse or the domestic partner takes 1/3 of the separate property. So you've got to look at it like a line going down of however many children that the decedent had, say 3 children. If there are survivors in more than one line of children, right? Child A, child B, child C. If child A survives and the children of child B survive, surviving spouse takes 1/3. If child A survives, child B and C do not survive and leave no issue, and issue of child A does survive as well, then the surviving spouse gets 1/2 because it's just one line going down through, for one child. There has to be some representation from the children, from at least 2 children, or lines going down of 2 children for the surviving spouse's share to be cut down to 1/3. Okay? So those are our 3 scenarios for the surviving spouse or domestic partner. Okay? All, half, or 1/3 of the separate property state. All if no issue or parent survives. Half if a parent, issue of a parent, or only one child or issue of one child survives. And 1/3 if at least 2 children or any issue in the line of at least 2 children survive.